So thank you everyone for coming and welcome to the webinar, which we're doing with Qimaging and photometrics. My name is George Ward. I'm the Scientific Content and Marketing Executive here at Scientifica, and I hope that today you're going to enjoy this webinar with James McKechnie from Qimaging. Just a little bit of admin to start. If you want to say anything, there is the chat box at the bottom. On the right hand side, so if you have any issues during the webinar, then just let me know. If you can't hear me, then write it down here, and I will write in there just to check that everyone can hear in a second. There is a Q&A box just to the left of that. If you have any questions, then please write them in here at any time during the webinar, and we will get James to answer them at the end for you. I've also put a little poll in here just asking if you're currently using a camera, which camera technology you use. I can see a couple of you already done that. If you could fill that up, that would be great. At the end, I will switch it to a slightly different poll just to see what you thought of the webinar today. So without any further ado, I'll hand you over to James McKechnie from Qimaging to do this presentation for us. So over to you, James.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good morning, wherever everyone is in the world. Thank you for joining us on this. As George said, I'm James McKechnie. I'm European Account Manager for Qimaging and Photometrics. So we make cameras for scientific imaging, mainly in the life sciences and mainly microscopy. So today we'll go through really deciding the best camera for use with your science. So we'll start with the technical differences between CCD, EMCCD, and sCMOS cameras. There's these three different kind of main technologies available there, and they all have slight advantages and disadvantages. I think the general rule is if there was one camera that did the job for everyone, well, then we would only be making that one camera. And obviously, there are quite a few different cameras. So really, we'll look at the differences between them and what's more suitable. And then we'll look at what you have to compromise when you're taking into account these differences. So once we've looked at the technical side of it, we'll look at, well, what is it you're actually looking to measure and how can we deal with that? We'll go through some example applications and some of the cameras, and then some of the other considerations. So we'll start with some of the technical differences between camera technologies that are available. So if we start with CCD. CCD is kind of the most straightforward to think about and is the one that has been used the most in microscopy and scientific imaging. So we start here with looking at a CCD sensor, and we have a 4x4 pixel camera, not the biggest camera in the world, but let's just start to think about it. And really what we're saying here is these dots are units of charge. So the photons have hit our sensor, have been converted into electrons, and then this is what we're visualizing here with these dots. And as I say, this is a 4x4 pixel array, so we have a different amount of light in each pixel to create an image. So once we've collected the light into each pixel, we would shutter it, which on this particular camera would need a physical shutter, but in most cameras you'd have in your labs, we'll have will be an interline device, so we'll have a masked area to move under. And then we start to read it out. And with a CCD camera, what we actually do is we read each row at a time into this serial register. So it's kind of like a holding pen for each row of signal. And then read that out pixel by pixel through the output node, through a preamp, and then to an analog to digital converter, or ADC, because that's a bit of a mouthful. And the important bit to note here is that really every single pixel gets read by the same ADC through the same electronics and through the same analog to digital converter. So why is that important? Well, it It means two things. One, it means that we're always getting the same noise statistics. We're always having the same readout on that. But also, if you actually think about it, that one ADC has a lot of work to do. Um, we make cameras that go from 1.4 million pixels to 6 million pixels that are on CCD technology. And let's take the 1.4 million pixel camera as a starting point. Well, at live frame rate, kind of maximum frame rate, that runs at 10 frames a second. So this analog to digital converter here is having to take 1.4 million pixels 10 times a second and read each pixel individually. So it's making 14 million calculations a second. It's going very quickly, even though that's kind of what we class as quite a slow readout. So why does the speed that read, why is that important? Well, if I use an example of, let's say I took a bucket of oranges and throw them on the floor and say, right, let's count those oranges. Well, if I asked someone to count them and gave them 5 minutes to count that, they would take some time, pick each one up, check it's an orange, and then put them in piles and check and double check and get a very accurate number of how many are there. But then if I say, right, well, you've got 3 seconds to count that pile of oranges, and then I'm going to throw another pile of oranges at you, and you've got to count those. You'll just take a look at it and go, oh, there's 100 there, and make a guess. It's the same with the camera. In this case, the faster we want to read, the greater our uncertainty. And whenever we have an uncertainty with the signal, we count that as noise. So you'll see on camera spec sheets, there's often a number of different noise characteristics of the camera. And the one that a lot of people compare is the read noise. That's the uncertainty with reading the signal. And that happens here. So at the ADC, we get hit by our read noise. Now, other noise characteristics are the dark current, which is dependent on how long your exposure is and how deeply you cool a lot of cameras. But in most cases, if you're doing something reasonably dynamic, then your dark current is going to be quite low compared to your exposure time. And then photon shot noise is the square root of every signal. So really, in most cases, we want to get to the point where we're photon shot noise limited. But we'll come back to that. But really, I guess the point to note here is, as we say, we read each pixel individually through the same ADC. So CCD gives us some nice features. Because we expose our light into the pixels and then either, as I said earlier, either shutter them or move them under a mask or something like that, then we're capturing all of the images, all of the pixels at exactly the same time. So you get no artifacts for that, and that will be important with other technologies. All pixels are treated the same. They will go through the same output node, same preamp, and same ADC. So you get a very definable and understandable noise distribution. You can use binning on a CCD camera. So by binning, we take groups of pixels and read them and kind of add them together before we read them out. So if you do a 2x2 bin, you're effectively getting 4 times the signal before you get to the read noise. So you get an advantage to be able to do that, and that will speed up our ability to read out as well because we're reading less pixels. Our gain is controllable, and we'll talk about gain in a bit. One of the nice things, CCD's been around for so long, you have a lot of choices on different sensors, whether it's down to pixel size, if you want monochrome or color, and a wide range of pricing as well. You tend not to need any extra correction factors or anything like that with that, and we have some high QE sensors, quantum efficiency. Again, we'll come on to that. So CCD is really great for long exposure times. Where it's not so good is because we're reading each pixel through the same ADC, to keep the noise down, we are limited by speed. So as I say, on a 1.4 million pixel camera, you're probably about 10 frames a second. That's starting to increase as we start to double tap and use different ways of getting the sensor to work. But yeah, you're still limited on the speed you're getting. And you higher read noise than some of the other technologies available. Which takes us to EMCCD. So EMCCD is a CCD camera with an extra little trick on it. So the extra little trick is this EM register here. So EMCCD cameras are used for low light. So what we'll do is if we have a single kind of unit of light that comes into our sensor here, we shift that under the mask to read it out. And then we move it up into the serial register. And then rather than just reading it out, we do a special trick. So we run it through our EM register. And this is effectively a series of voltage potentials that adds electrons to our signal. It was once described to me as bouncing an electron off the wall to pick up more electrons, but that's, I gather, quite simplistic. But you go, right, well, so we go through our EM register, 2, 3, 5, and then we've boosted our signal before, and this is the important bit, before we get to the point where we read it out. So what that allows us to do is actually clock that sensor, clock the ADC much, much faster than we were on a standard CCD camera. So you tend to find that these cameras are available to go much, much faster than you can on a standard CCD. Why this is true is because we're clocking that faster, we're getting a higher noise, we're getting a higher read noise. So a lot of our EMCCD cameras will be somewhere around 50, 60 electrons of read noise. But we're boosting our signal before we reach that. And so we're effectively boosting the signal up above the read noise and making it able to see. Now, this isn't a lossless situation. So if you look here, we go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 5. What we're kind of visualizing there as well, there's an uncertainty associated to what your multiplication will be through that register. So, and whenever we have an uncertainty, that's another noise characteristic. So really, EMCCD cameras are useful in specific applications. And those specific applications are where you have very, very little light, but want to go very quickly. Generally, you'll find that they have very high sensitivity in terms of quantum efficiency. The sensors we use tend to be 95% QE for the fact that that's where you're aimed at. You're going 70 frames a second in full resolution of 512 by 512, but you can go much, much quicker. So you can, on these cameras, use kind of just small areas of the sensor and get up to thousands of frames a second. And this is one of the points that you often have to remember is if you want to go 1,000 frames a second, you need to be collecting enough light from your sample in 1,000th of a second to get you to that speed. So yeah, that's why the extremely high sensitivity and boosting above the noise becomes important. Most of them are dual readout. So generally you'll find that you can read it as a standard CCD camera if you don't want to use EM gain. And again, because it's CCD, we have a very kind of straightforward noise characteristic with it. Often the problems with these, you kind of look at it as problems and kind of solutions. So the large pixel size is a problem if you just want to take a basic image. They tend to have, so the 512 by 512 sensor has a 16 micron pixel, which takes you to a resolution kind of problem, which again we'll come on to in a short amount of time. We have something called the excess noise factor, which is this uncertainty with how much you're actually increasing your signal in the EM register. And that becomes important when you get to looking at, well, that basically multiplies that photon shot noise I spoke about. And so you get to a certain point where actually using an EMCCD camera will be more noisy than just using a standard straightforward CCD camera. And you're reasonably limited on your sensor choice. So where would you use this is where you're at the point where your read noise limited. So where you're at a point where you have very, very little light, your signal is lost in the read noise, and then you're just bringing some of that signal out of the read noise. So single molecule turf fluorescence kind of applications. I think generally you don't tend to get pretty looking images with an EMCCD camera. They tend to be good data, but yeah, they don't look nice, as you can see here. And then we move on to CMOS. So CMOS is a technology that actually has been around a lot longer than people give it credit for, but it's kind of coming to the forefront of microscopy at the moment. And CMOS, rather than reading each pixel, collecting the pixels and then reading through a single ADC, what we actually do is we kind of make the measurement on the pixel. So here's a pixel, and here's a pixel, here's a pixel, and so here, here, here. And we have these pixels in rows and columns, as always, but at the bottom of each column, you have an ADC for each column. So why is that important? Well, that means that we can actually get higher speeds overall on the camera, but because we have these running in parallel along the columns, you can run each one much slower. And by running each ADC much slower, we end up getting a much lower read noise from it. So if you were to take a standard kind of HD chip, that would be 1920 by 1080 pixels. So you have 1920 analog to digital converters running in parallel along the columns. Now, as I say, what we're actually doing here is taking each measurement on the pixel side, and then you can see here we're closing the gate to get that down to the ADC. So we do that in rows. So here the bottom row is exposing. But what you'll do is you'll read off the top row, then the next row, then the next row, and so on and so forth down. You don't have the area to kind of store charge like we're doing on a CCD. And why is that important? Well, that can cause some problems, and we'll come on to those in a short second. The nice thing about it, though, is that you get these very high speeds. So for a 4 million pixel sensor, you can end up going 100 frames a second with a read noise of less than 2, even 1.5 electrons. They have similar sensitivities to a CCD camera, so you're not kind of losing out there. And a large field of view. You get a really big sensor here while still reading quickly. Problems, you don't get the same advantage of binning. So if you want to use binning to kind of increase your signal before you get to the read noise, well, because we're measuring each one at the pixel here, you're effectively just doing a kind of addition afterwards with binning. You tend to have a non-Gaussian noise distribution, which again, if you were just taking a picture, like the webcam in my computer here is going to be using a CMOS sensor. I don't suppose it matters in this situation that it's a non-Gaussian noise distribution. But if you really want to make measurements close to the noise and understand what's going on, then it's a very different aspect to with a CCD. And then finally, rolling shutter. And that was what I was saying with the kind of issues with reading each line at a time. So if we look at this image here, it shows the rolling shutter quite nicely. And what you can see is this is an image of a propeller plane taken with a CMOS camera. What will have happened is the first row will have exposed and read out. But in the time that it takes to then start exposing the next row or start reading out the next row, the propeller will have moved around a little bit. And as we go down, we're actually moving at kind of the same rate as the propeller, which gives us this very strange looking artifact. Now, obviously on this plane, it's actually not, it doesn't look like this in real life. So this isn't normally a problem for kind of imaging in day-to-day life, but where you start to notice it is if you're making measurements of a sample that is moving very quickly, then you can start to see distortions. And this is also true if you're using a CMOS camera to make measurements of intensity change, for instance, because actually, well, if our whole area is changing intensity at kind of the same temporal resolution as um, this rolling shutter artifact, as the chip, well, maybe it goes very bright, our cell goes very bright for a bit and then goes and dims down again. Well, if the top of the cell is showing up as bright, does that mean that that is actually what's happening? Or does it mean that it just happened that the whole cell was bright at the time when the rolling shutter was at the top? It's one of those things that in a lot of cases won't make a difference, but in those cases where it does, it is well worth considering because you can really get false results from what's going on. Now, there are some ways around this. So one of the other points where a rolling shutter will be an issue is if you wanted to do very quick two-channel acquisitions. And what we can do in that case is actually do something like this. So this is a graph just showing the exposure of each row of our camera. And then what we can actually do is trigger our light source to only come on at the points when all of the rows of the camera are exposing. So if we take a kind of standard example where we said the CMOS camera is running 100 frames a second, well, that means that in general, this time it will take to do the whole roll down the sensor is 10 milliseconds, because that's our limiting factor on frame rate, is how quickly we can read the sensor out, as long as our exposure times are shorter than the read time. But that's our limit, is how quickly can we read that sensor out. So it takes 10 milliseconds to roll down the sensor. Well, if we ask the camera to expose for 15 milliseconds per row, what you'll find is that in the first 10 milliseconds, we're kind of rolling down a sensor, which we can see on this area here. And then, but this row still has only exposed for 10 milliseconds. So it needs to expose for another 5. So it exposes 15. Now this bottom row, when that starts exposing, which will be about 10 milliseconds after that, it still needs to expose for its full 15. So at least for the first 5 here, the whole lot will be exposing at the same time. And there are trigger modes on the camera that means you can turn LEDs or lasers on for that point when all rows are exposing. What that means is you tend to get a small hit on the frame rate, so because we need that slightly longer exposure time, but you can actually make these rolling shutter cameras work in a kind of pseudo-global shutter. Now, we mentioned there how low noise the CMOS is, and EMCCD is suitable for very, very high sensitivity acquisitions where you want to go fast. And again, I said CMOS is very fast. So where would you pick a CMOS against an EMCCD? Well, when we look at the EMCCD, it has a much higher quantum efficiency, but more importantly, it has a larger pixel size. And if you were to use your 60 times 1.4 NA objective and just plug both cameras into the side of your microscope, actually what you'll find is that the actual area that is being collected by that pixel on the EMCCD is so much greater, about 8 times greater than what you're seeing on a sCMOS. So even though the noises might be comparable, the QEs are within bounds, then yeah, the actual pixel size makes a big difference. Now you can put different objectives on, you can change different ways of kind of projecting the light onto the sensor, but most people have their set magnifications they're using, and in that case you'll see 8 times a greater signal to noise on the EMCCD camera than you will on the CMOS. So we actually have a little video where we went through each exposure time to show that. And you do see the sample kind of become measurable much, much, much quicker on an EMCCD camera in that case. When we look at this again, we always make a compromise when we're choosing cameras. We've spoken about, to an extent, the frame rate, sensitivity, resolution. We'll look at each one of those in more detail. But you generally find that you can't really have everything at once. You're always going to be making a compromise. As we spoke about here, the pixel size really does make a difference to sensitivity. But when we come on to resolution, it also makes a difference there. So you're always going to be struggling between the two. So let's actually define what we mean by sensitivity. You have to excuse me, my voice is slightly going here. But sensitivity is pretty much, we called it a horrible word, because it means so many different things to so many different people. It's often confused with quantum efficiency. It's affected by pixel size, the amount of signal you have. There's all kinds of things that determine sensitivity. But the kind of one thing that is always true is that if I turn around to someone and say, would you like a camera with more sensitivity? They'll always say yes, but that doesn't necessarily ring true. You don't know which bit is required. You could say that signal to noise is the kind of defining factor that we're looking for here. You want a good enough signal to noise to make your measurements on your sample. But signal to noise is made up of 2 bits. It's made up of signal and it's made up of noise. So sensitivity could mean let's find ways to increase our signal or reduce our noise. There's different ways that we can do this. We do know some things though. So photons are converted to electrons at the sensor. You have light coming, it's converted into electrons, and that conversion rate is defined as our quantum efficiency. So you convert some photons, some wavelengths better than others. And as we said earlier, the number of photons that actually interact with our pixel depends on the pixel size. So if it's raining, as it was here earlier, and you want to collect some water, some rainwater, and measure how much rainwater is falling out of the sky, well, if I put outside a glass and I put outside a bucket and I put outside a skip, then obviously I'm going to collect more rain into my skip. So the bigger the pixel, the more light you're collecting from your sample per pixel. However, that does have the effect on resolution. If you want to know exactly where that rain is falling, then obviously with the skip, you're at the point where you can only work it out to the area of that pixel. But we'll come on to that. But we can have a sensitive sensor, but if our signal to noise isn't good enough, it's still not good enough. We speak about quantum efficiency, and I am well aware, by the way, that I am speaking very quickly, going through a lot of this in a lot of detail. We normally run this as kind of a 2-day course that we can do, and so we've picked out the best bits and kind of trying to give an overview. But if there are bits that you would like more information on in the future, then please contact us as well. But yes, so sensitivity and quantum efficiency are joined, and I'll skip some of this part about quantum efficiency, other than to say the bits that are important here are really, we always give a graph of quantum efficiency. So this is percentage of photons converted to electrons that we can measure against wavelength. And so here you can see, if we kind of pick the lower one, well, actually, if we were looking at a dye like Psi5, then somewhere around here, we really don't have a great quantum efficiency on this orange line. We only have maybe 5%. Whereas this camera has a great quantum efficiency. We're getting 90% of it done. Now, does that matter? Does QE matter? And the general rule is it depends. There we go, that's a great cop out. But it does depend. Quantum efficiency helps if you don't have much light to start with. If you've got an awful lot of light, then really the quantum efficiency doesn't matter. 5% of a very, very large number is still quite a large number. But quantum efficiency matters at the point where either you've gone off the end of the scale, you're not able to detect any light, or you're in a situation where every photon counts, or you're trying to make as much of get as much light into your sensor as you can. It can often be a kind of false thing because it's very easy to visualize here. We have nice curves that show us. Well, if we were to compare between, let's say, this camera and go, right, which ones? And these are quite old ones, but I think the kind of situation still stands. But this camera is, say, half the price of this camera. Well, that's a 10% change in QE there. What does a 10% change in QE mean to your science? If we were using a 50 millisecond exposure time, let's say, and we needed to go 10 frames a second, so 50 millisecond exposure time is well beneath that, and we have a 10% QE advantage by spending twice as much money, would we do it? And generally, to kind of simulate that, well, if you were on 50% 50 millisecond exposure time with your lower QE camera, going up by 10%, you'd get a 45 millisecond exposure time. Like the exposure time, if you actually compare the exposure times, it doesn't make a huge difference. Where it matters is if you're trying to collect every single photon. Hope that made sense. So kind of, please let me know if you want me to go through that again. But we'll move on in the meantime to gain. So gain is camera control that we're all used to from analog cameras. You kind of have a dial, you can turn up gain and get brighter image. On a digital camera, it's not quite the same. It's at the point where what gain is doing needs to be understood, and then you can use it well. So gain can be used to see signal in real time or minimize your exposure times. However, you are doing that generally at the cost of dynamic range. So what gain is actually doing on a camera is amplifying the signal relative to the image scale. So where we said, right, quantum efficiency is us converting photons into electrons. And then we measure each of those buckets or pixels of electrons. And we put them into an image that we display or measure from on a screen. Well, that image has a defined bit depth. You have 8-bit images, you have 12-bit images, and you have 16-bit images. Sometimes a 14-bit image. What you don't really have is an 8-bit, a 12-bit, 14-bit, or a 16-bit camera. It's just the image we give out at the other end is 8-bit, 12-bit, 14-bit, 16-bit. What gain is that relationship between electrons you can collect and image bit depth. So here we're saying gain can be thought of as electrons per ADU, analog to digital unit. So what we call in the UK, grayscale. So if you had a camera that you can keep collecting light into your pixel, but at the point where it saturates, at the point where you can collect no more light, you have, let's say, 2,000 electrons in there, and you want to spread that over a 12-bit image, which has 4,096 grayscales available to you. Well, then, as a gain in the factory, we would kind of set that as a standard gain state to be for every 2 grayscales, you have 1 electron. So 2,000 goes into 4,000. We give you the option on the camera gain to say, well, actually, why don't you can increase that level and so that it feels like your signal gets brighter quicker. You're kind of spreading it in a different way. What that means is it looks like you don't need as long an exposure time to get a white part of your image to fill up the full way. What you're actually doing, your signal's not changing on your camera. The amount of light hitting your sensor isn't changing. It's just showing you a different way of displaying it. So a gain is often thought to increase noise, and of course it's not actually doing that. What it's actually doing is increasing the number of grayscales that noise is looking at. So it feels noisier, but that's because you need less light to get to the same exposure. One problem with that is that because you're reducing how many electrons you can effectively fit in each pixel, you're effectively lowering dynamic range, which gives you a kind of issue, if you like, with that. So does gain matter? Gain only matters if you're looking to compare measurements. Really, you should always go from comparing measurements in grayscales to comparing them back to measuring in the electrons per pixel, the electrons you've collected in each pixel. And there's a number of ways you can do that, but that's a much more involved discussion. What I would say matters more than kind of any of those points is signal to noise ratios. And there's different ways you can measure that. So we actually have a number of ways that you can improve signal to noise. Generally, the best way to improve signal to noise is to expose for longer. The more signal you've got, the better. But there are on certain cameras kind of denoising algorithms and enhancement algorithms which keep the ability to quantify the data, but allow you to actually kind of bring that signal up above the noise. So where sensitivity is important is obviously at the point where you don't have much light. Low light fluorescence when you're looking at calcium or single molecule kind of work. And generally what we'd look for here is sCMOS cameras where you want to go very, very quickly, but you've got a reasonable amount of light. You're not really kind of crunching at the lowest end, or single shot where you want to reduce exposure times, etc. EMCCD cameras are where you need to go very high speed with very low light. And then if you want to expose for a long time, then a CCD camera is best. And then really, if you're not at the point where sensitivity is a problem, you can look at some of the other bits. So we can look at resolution. Resolution is ultimately dependent on a couple of things. You can think of it as a kind of different points of resolution. The objective you're using on your microscope or your lens, the NA of that is really giving you a lot of the resolution. That's the limiting factor of your microscope. And then the camera resolution is dependent on the size of the pixel. So we get to the point where we're asked a lot, well, what's the resolution of that camera? And you start to think about it and talk about spatial resolution. Again, no, number of megapixels. Well, no, the number of megapixels doesn't affect your ability to tell 2 points apart. It does if you were to take, say, a camera on a phone, because I can take a picture of you from here. Not that I can see anyone, but if I was actually in a room, take a picture of you from here, and I don't know. I think this might have 8 million pixels, and so the kind of screen I'm pointing this camera at is spread over those 8 million pixels. Now, if I move it closer, then I can take a picture much closer and get those. Each of those 8 million pixels has a lot more detail that it can visualize because you're moving closer. On a microscope, you don't have that luxury. On a microscope, you have fixed lenses, and so the pixel size is what becomes important to the resolution you can look at. The number of pixels will affect the field of view at that point. And well, a mixture of pixel size and number of pixels. The sensor size affects the field of view. We have been asked in the past what the DPI of a camera is. It depends what printer you've got. Just print it out. But yeah, I think generally when we talk about resolution, we're normally talking about spatial resolution, how well you can tell 2 points apart. So where that becomes important is if you're patching and where you're really looking at very, very kind of fine structures. So for that, we generally recommend a few different cameras. We have Rolera Bolt, which is perfect small pixels, 3.5 micron pixels, and a high frame rate, 30 frames per second. So you get this kind of live and low small pixels. You have a CCD camera, which actually runs at, again, 30 frames per second, or a bit slower, 24 frames per second, I think it is. But live field of view, live temporal resolution, but also a reasonable sensitivity. Slightly larger pixels than the Bolt, which again, if you're looking for fluorescence imaging, you want to start to make these compromises by, well, do we go for very small pixels against very large pixels? One thing I should note there is I spoke about the microscope resolution at the beginning and then saying about the camera. You always want the camera resolution to sort of just drift just underneath the microscope resolution. So you never want to be oversampling by too much, but you never want to be undersampling. And because they're kind of fixed points, you tend to be able to pick a camera that matches the objectives you're looking to use. And then if you want a very large field of view, high speed, then you have these 4 million pixel sensors that are running at very high speeds as well. And I speak about speed, and we talk about frame rate. And frame rate can be improved in a number of ways. It can be improved by binning on CCD cameras. It can be improved by just taking a smaller area of your chip. If you want to look at a smaller area of the chip of your field of view, then by taking that smaller area, you can start to speed up your camera and start to look at various points there. The biggest one, though, is normally just by decreasing your exposure time. If your camera is capable of running 10 frames per second, but your sampler only lets you kind of get a 500 millisecond exposure time to see something, well, then you're only ever going to be able to run at 2 frames per second. So using things like binning to increase your sensitivity, using things like the gain and histogram clipping, if you can just get more light from the sample, which would be lovely for everyone, then you can increase your frame rate from exposure time. And finally, PC connections. You often find that some cameras will have multiple options, USB 2 against USB 3, some have PCI Express cards if you want to go even faster. So there's different ways you can get that up. So where frame rate is important? As you can imagine, it's basically anywhere we want to look at something fast. But often it's kind of overlooked for things like patching, where frame rate becomes important because you want a live feed that you can visualize easily. And so in that case, understanding the frame rate of the camera and how that fits against that compromise with sensitivity and frame rate becomes important as well. So some example cameras where we go fast are the Optimos and the Prime, and then the Delta, where you're looking at 100 frames per second, or in this case, 67 frames per second in full resolution, or if you take a very small region, you can go very, very fast. The reason I put that up there is because it brings us on to that other point, which is, well, compromise between sensitivity and resolution. At 70 frames per second, you might be having enough light to have that, I think it's a 14 millisecond exposure, is about 70 frames per second. Let's say you go to 5,000 frames per second. Do you have enough light coming from your sample that in 1/5,000th of a second, you get enough light into your camera to be able to see something? And this, again, when we get to high frame rates, becomes important to balance. Well, do you have enough light to capture in that small amount of time to get the high frame rates? Other considerations that we should think about are your camera can do 100 frames per second. Can your software handle that data? Can the hardware handle that data? Do you need SSDs, etc.? What field of view do you need to work for your application? And how long do you need to stream for? Some software will only stream to the RAM of the computer rather than to the hard disk. So if you want to stream for a large amount of time, how long can you stream for? And yeah, exactly that. What's the data rate? I mean, if we're running 100 frames a second in 4 million pixel, 16-bit images, you've got a lot of data coming down. So we have some kind of tricks around that. We have options to, on the camera head, reduce the amount of data that you're transferring. So you're just capturing the areas you want, but you still have to consider that on that side. Are you triggering? Are you looking at other devices? And then really, you come back to all the things: cost, future-proofing, software, etc. I realize I'm running reasonably over here, so I'll kind of keep this going. So in summary, really, I think the point to note is no camera is suitable for every application. Trying a couple of options is often helpful to decide, but the biggest thing is normally to understand exactly where you're willing to make those compromises and what the compromises and kind of points you want are. Is it that you need a high sensitivity camera because you want to expose for a shorter period of time, or you want to go quicker? What is it that matters to you? And the same with resolution. Would you prefer a smaller pixel so that you can resolve finer objects, or uh, is that going to hold you up with the sensitivity side of things? So that is as I say, a brief overview of what we look at in terms of picking cameras and choosing cameras. And yeah, I'll hand back over to George for questions and anything else that comes up. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, James. That was great. So yes, if anyone has any questions, please do type them in the Q&A box on the bottom left-hand corner, and I will get to them as quickly as possible. We've got one already, which is quite specific to the person's needs, but he's asking, we need to record at 50 hertz a populations of cells, neurons and astrocytes loaded with a fluorescent calcium sensor. We usually use a xenon light source and acquire at 2 Hz with a photometric camera coupled with a mechanical shutter. Should we change our light source to acquire at 50 Hz? What would you recommend? And are there any computer requirements for this?
Okay, so I think probably we want to look at this offline to kind of understand it more. But from what you're
Yeah.
saying there, it sounds like if you're using a mechanical shutter, that will be a very problematic point, if you like, because that takes time to open and close. It's so if you're looking to go for 50 hertz, then your shutter normally, I think they take, I can't remember off the top of my head, but they kind of take 10 milliseconds or something like that. So they're not going to be able to work in that kind of time scale. So in terms of the light source, you'll probably find that you can use it. It depends it depends on if you're looking to switch channels or whether you're just illuminating with a single channel. Because at 50 hertz, you're probably not going to bother even turning the light on and off very quickly because it's uh, uh, it's it just dual channel. You probably need to change the light source as well, or at least look at different ways of illuminating.
Okay, thank you. You might have just noticed I've just changed the poll that you can see. So if you could answer this, it's just want to know if you found the webinar useful. That would be absolutely great. And if anyone has any more questions, I will wait for a few more seconds to see if anyone has anything they want to ask.
I would say with that specific case as well, yeah, get in touch and we can discuss it a bit more.
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, we've got another one here. So you mentioned rolling shutter distortion as an example of temporal distortions in an image. Is the reading timing accurate enough that post-image software can correct distortions?
Yes and no. Yes, so you can correct post. You can, well, let's put it this way. You can you can work out where it came from and do something about it. But if there is, let's use the example I kind of spoke about earlier, where you want to do dual channel. The problem you'll get is that half your sensor will have exposed for some of that one channel and half for some of the other channel, and so actually it's not quite as simple as just reassigning. It's the same with that. Uh, it's the same with that picture of the uh, propeller. You can't really say, well, we know exactly where it came from because you still have the exposure time in. So yeah, you can think about it. You can use it to work it out, but at the same time, you can't really correct for it. I guess is the point.
Okay, thank you very much.
I hope that answers. Yeah.
Yeah, that was great. So you've got another one here. Could you improve signal to noise ratio by averaging images, e.g., average every 3 images if 30 Hertz is sufficiently fast? Can you do that on camera or do you have to rely on software?
So you could. The downside to that is, well, the nice thing about a digital image is that actually you don't need to do that. If 30 hertz is okay for you, and you have a camera that can run 100 frames a second, well, by setting a 33 millisecond exposure time, you're actually just collecting a single image in and still running at 33 hertz, 30 hertz, because you're just increasing your exposure time. So that's kind of the recommended way to do it. The problem with averaging images is that you're not actually collecting more light per. You're not overcoming the noise. You will average out photon shot noise, but if you're read noise limited, well, you're not actually overcoming that. So yeah, I would recommend always go for as long an exposure as you can, rather than the other way around. With an analog camera, you were stuck with the exposure, the frame rate that you're stuck with. So you had to average images to do the similar thing. But with a digital camera, you can set your exposure time as you want.
Right, okay. Um, Last chance to ask any questions. Um, Otherwise, we will call it a day.
Remembering for everyone in America, it's now 5:30 in the UK, so we're
Oh,
getting to
well,
that
yeah,
point.
we will call it a day. Right, okay, it doesn't look like there's any more questions. So thank you everyone for coming along, and thank you James for giving the presentation. Um, if you haven't filled out the poll and would like to do so, then please do. It's great to get some feedback. If you would like to ask any questions, then you can email them to me. I've just put my email address in the chat down there, and I will forward them on to James if I need some help answering them. So thank you very much, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Great, thank you.